Opening the center establishes immediate pawn presence and prepares development. Establishing central presence immediately, challenging white's pawn and opening lines for development. Developing the knight opens diagonals and prepares to castle, subtly eyeing control of the center. Unbalancing the early development by immediately challenging central pawns and creating early tactical possibilities. Challenging black's queenside structure, white immediately seeks to exploit the exposed bishop. Solidifying the center pawns sets up a defensive structure, anticipating future pawn pushes and preparing for piece development. Opening the center this way often grants white central pawn control and potentially active piece play against black's slightly cramped position. Re-establishing central pawn presence after the exchange, but it invites white's pieces into more active central squares. Initiating immediate pressure on the queenside pawn structure, this maneuver aims to exploit black's potentially awkward development. Developing the knight to c6 neatly fortifies the central pawn and prepares to contest the crucial queenside squares, enhancing black's structural integrity. Instantly pinning the knight, white prepares to dismantle black's central pawn structure. Solidifying the bishop's defensive post, this allows black to regroup and prepare for the central pawn tug-of-war ahead. Eliminating the active bishop liberates black's pawn structure, opening lines for piece development. Recapturing with the knight reclaims central influence, bolstering the pawn structure and preparing for queenside development. Solidifying the center and preparing for castling kingside brings a sense of order to white's position. Centralizing the queen offers flexibility for maneuvers and potential attacks on the queen side, while also preparing to contest the d-file. Developing the knight to a more active square, preparing for queenside expansion. Castling now secures the king and prepares to connect the rooks, a vital step in developing attacking potential. The rook's occupation of the open column signals imminent pressure along the c-file, hinting at future pawn advances or piece sacrifices to break open the center. Initiating queenside expansion with a5 seeks to contest the open c-file and gain space. Securing the queenside pawn structure solidifies white's influence and prevents any immediate black ideas of b5. Fortifying the queenside pressure and preparing to contest the open c-file, a sensible positional undertaking. Activating the bishop to a central diagonal, this aims to pressure black's queenside pawns and potentially offer exchanges to relieve pressure. Ambitious wing expansion, but it might overextend your queenside pawns and create weaknesses. Concentrating pressure on the queen side, this redirects the queen to support potential pawn advances or to coordinate with the rook. Trading bishops here opens up the c-file for rook activity and simplifies the position, potentially leading to a more dynamic middle-game battle. Clearing the queen from the d-file opens the path for centralized piece play. Seeking to reroute the knight to a more active square, aiming for c6 or e6 to support the pawn structure. Securing the king's safety by castling is a priority, freeing up the rook for potential central involvement. Seeking to unblock the c8 rook and activate the knight, this maneuver prepares for potential central breaks. Sharpening the attack along the c-file, white now mobilizes the rook with purpose. Expanding on the queenside pawn chain to disrupt white's central structure and create counterplay. Recapturing on c2 strategically prepares to challenge the queenside initiative and consolidate the center's influence. Mobilizing the rook to the semi-open file establishes active piece play and prepares for potential pawn advances on the queen side. Preparing to support a central pawn push while developing its knight to a more active square. Unveiling a latent knight maneuver, black aims to reposition this piece towards the king side, potentially bolstering its central influence and preparing for future advances. Ramping up pressure on the queen side, white bravely stakes a claim on the vulnerable c-file, aiming to disrupt black's harmony. Unburdening the queen side, black intends to reroute the knight to a more active post, potentially supporting a pawn push or influencing the center. Targeting the queenside expansion, This knight aims to reinforce the central presence and restrict black's ambitious pawn storm. Harnessing the knight's latent power, this maneuver aims to redeploy the steed to a more active outpost, potentially creating future mating threats or improving piece coordination. Repositioning the knight to ***, NB4 seeks to exploit the weakened light squares on the queenside, potentially harassing the queenside pawns or setting up a future infiltration. Clearing the central ranks allows the rook to escape the pawn chain's confinement. Saddling the queen to a precarious outpost, hoping to lure black into positional concessions. A bold attempt to untangle the rook from its current predicament, though it may expose the king later. Focusing the pressure on the open d-file, white aims to dismantle black's queenside pawn structure. The exchange on the open file frees black's queen and prepares for increased pawn pressure on white's queenside. This exchange seizes control of the vital c-file, promising future pressure on black's queenside. Repositioning the rook to the central files solidifies the defense and prepares for a potential pawn push. Seizing the open file with the rook is a bold assertion, aiming to disrupt black's queenside stability. Opening the c-file is a bold risk, creating an immediate pawn deficit but aiming for active counterplay against white's somewhat scattered forces. Exploiting the open file, this knight aggressively penetrates to the 6th rank, forcing immediate concessions and aiming to disrupt black's delicate pawn structure. Centralizing the queen offers a defensive pawn shield and prepares counterplay on the c-file. Sacrificing material for king's safety is a bold gambit, aiming to disrupt black's consolidated structure. Black consolidates material, aiming to untangle the queenside pawns despite the queen's slightly exposed position. Securing the queenside pawn chain after the exchanges, white prepares to activate their rook and apply pressure. Securing that central square with the queen, eyeing potential counterplay and defending against immediate threats. Exchanging queens now simplifies to an endgame where white's active rook and superior pawn structure will be decisive. Re-establishing central pawn presence after the exchange solidifies black's influence in the upcoming endgame skirmish. Repositioning the knight to the queenside aims to stabilize the pawn structure and prepare for a long endgame fight. Initiating king repositioning to bolster the weak knight outposts and prepare for a more active endgame. A prudent step, consolidating the king's safety amidst the queenside pawn structure's impending reshuffling. Bringing the monarch into the fray activates the king, preparing for the coming pawn tussle and potential endgame skirmishes. Centralizing the monarch enhances its defensive and offensive capabilities in this quiet phase. Mobilizing the king towards the center is a sound principle in simplified positions, aiming to activate a dormant piece. The king ventures out, aiming to seize central space and prepare for the upcoming pawn endgame. Securing the central square with the monarch solidifies the king's position. The knight repositions to bolster the central pawn structure, aiming to restrict black's mobility and prepare for a kingside initiative. Pivoting the knight to the queenside aims to contest that open file and activate a dormant piece. The knight's repositioning to the rim aims to support potential pawn advances on the queenside, creating new avenues of attack. Reinforcing the central pawn structure is a logical step to prevent further incursions from white's knight. Solidifying the pawn structure around the king provides a necessary defensive shield against potential future threats. The knight now solidifies its dominion over the c7 square, setting the stage for potential queenside expansion. A tactical detour, forcing the knight's repositioning and opening the path for a pawn advance. King repositioning aims to contest the central files and secure shelter. Opening the center with this pawn thrust aims to activate your king and pressure black's pawn structure. Exchanging pawns opens lines, potentially benefiting white's knight by creating dynamic possibilities. Opening the e-file now solidifies white's central pawn presence. Shifting the knight to e6 prepares to solidify the king side, or potentially swing it towards the queen side. The king ventures forward, aiming to support the central pawns and potentially chase black's knight. The knight retreats, preserving its influence but relinquishing immediate central occupation. The monarch ventures out again, perhaps seeking new avenues for the white king. This knight's repositioning aims to anchor itself more strongly in the center and challenge white's king's march. Reinforcing the knight's central presence with nd5 targets weakness and restricts black's maneuvering options effectively. Realigning the monarch to a more secure square amidst white's encroaching cavalry. Asserting control of the kingside, this pawn push prepares potential advances and restricts black's knight. The knight tucks back, seeking refuge while preparing to defend the d-pawn and potentially redeploy for central influence. The knight hops forward, aiming to solidify central control and potentially threaten pawn advances. The king bravely marches to the center, seeking active participation in the unfolding endgame. Knight relocation begins a maneuver to seize control of key squares. Reclaiming central space with the knight offers a more active presence and eyes potential outposts. Realigning the king offers defensive support and prepares for pawn advances. Repositioning the king to a more active square aims to support the central pawn push and gain influence. Unlocking the central pawn's potential, this advance aims to create a decisive passed pawn and restrict black's king. A desperate attempt to activate the knight, aiming to disrupt white's advancing pawns before they become unstoppable. Snatching that advanced pawn forces a critical decision for black's pieces and opens lines toward his vulnerable king. Re-engaging the center, the black king bravely steps forward, aiming to support its remaining pawns. The knight's retreat to e6 stabilizes the queenside pawns and prepares to contest the d-file. Repositioning the knight to c5 opens a path for the pawn to advance and challenges white's knight's central dominance. Consolidating the central advantage and preparing to advance the kingside pawns for a decisive breakthrough. Repositioning the knight to e5 now aims to challenge white's knight and potentially establish a more active presence on the kingside. Repositioning the knight to a more aggressive diagonal, seeking to exploit any potential weaknesses. Knight activation on c4 injects a fresh tactical dynamic, challenging white's pawn structure and offering counterplay. Unleashing a knight fork aims to disrupt the pawn structure and create winning material advantages. Seeking safer shores, the king navigates towards the queenside, attempting to avoid the menacing knight and pawn advances. Aggressively advancing the king to confront black's scattered pawns, seeking to pry open lines. Navigating toward a safer square, the black king seeks to escape the impending pawn storm. Advancing the kingside pawn chain aims to create outposts for the knight and restrict black's bishop. Repositioning the knight to a potentially more active square, seeking to exploit any weaknesses in white's structure. Opening a vital path for the queen and knights to penetrate black's weakened defenses. Unleashing the knight from its pawn shield, black opens lines and seeks counterplay in the endgame. The open king's pawn now becomes a significant asset, potentially controlling key squares on the d-file and disrupting black's coordination. Unleashing the knight towards the center offers a dynamic possibility to disrupt white's pawn structure and create counterplay. Probing for weaknesses, this king's sidestep prepares to activate the queen's rook pawn. The knight's daring excursion into the opponent's territory aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and create counterplay. Opening a path for the queen towards the kingside blockade, this pawn advance aims to break open the position. Creating a fresh passed pawn out of thin air demands the opponent's constant vigilance. Unleashing the pawn's final push to disrupt the black king's shelter. The king's central confinement now presents a tempting target for the advancing pawns. King captures the pawn, simplifying to an endgame where white's activity should prevail.